We will now look more into the detail of a normed interaction. We saw that two types of directive can be used to implement a certain behavioral preference for an action A. We can recognize three types of essential differences there. Monitoring A, fulfillment, or monitoring not A, violation, may have different costs and different chances of success because of the two different evidence proxies the two monitoring require. We observed that it is not rational for the agent to provide evidence of violation with the risk of punishment. It is rational to provide evidence of fulfillment in case of reward. In general, the provision of reward may be conditional to the presence of a third-party certifier to improve the monitoring quality. The agent may have interest to forge the evidence to take the reward even in case of violation. So, the general elements of a normed interaction are an environment that generates a context in which the norm may be applicable, a performer which is the addressee of the norm and decides to or decides not to perform, possibly a certifier confirming the action, a monitor collecting either a proof of violation or a proof of fulfillment. If violation occurs, the enforcer should punish with a penalty. If fulfillment occurs, the enforcer should pay the reward. From a process point of view, the interaction passes from four stages. An environment sets the situational occurrence of an applicability context. In a performance phase, the agent decides whether to perform or not the action. The monitoring phase is about collecting evidence for positive or negative action. Depending on the result of monitoring and the enforcement regime, the enforcer may proceed in providing a reward or a punishment. More in detail, we consider a context that makes the norm applicable or not. This context may have deterministic components as spatial or temporal coordinates. For instance, in this city, during the night, you cannot go faster than 50 km per hour. Others are non-deterministic. For instance, if there is an ambulance coming, you need to make it pass. In the model template, we will refer to a probability P of C, capturing how often the agent may happen to be subjected to the norm. Once the agent acknowledges that the norm is applicable, the agent has to intend, and before then to decide, whether to perform or not the action, that is, whether to abide or not by the norm. In general, the agent may have other contextual reasons to decide in favor of D. The probability of the action to be successful is given by the probability of deciding to do the action and the probability of taking that decision, assuming there may be no involuntary way to obtain that action. For calculating the probability of taking a decision towards action, we introduce the P&C factor, capturing how often, when the norm applies, the preferential structure of the agent supersedes the normative provision, thus determining that the agent won't abide by the norm. This is about deliberated non-compliance, but we can also have unintentional non-compliance due to the fact that the action is a difficult one. Even if I want to follow the rule, I cannot, as I'm not able to perform the action. This is the external non-compliance. We define this factor at individual level. However, often policymakers apply aggregated forms of them, estimating how much compliance one has to expect with respect to that norm in the social context under focus. Monitoring is the starting point for any enforcement. As an enforcer, as I don't see directly performance or non-performance, I cannot possibly know whom to punish or to reward. As we observed before, generally we do not have access to the action, but only to proxy evidence to its occurrence. This proxy is plausibly selected to be the most discriminant. That is, the probability of its occurrence in presence of the action is much higher than the probability of its occurrence in absence of the action. Remember that we need to distinguish the proxy of O for performance from the proxy of first for non-performance. Additionally, we generally cannot monitor all cases for which the norm is applicable. We define therefore a probability P of M, which captures how frequent monitoring is among all applicable cases. We have the confusion matrix for classification, giving us some information about the quality of the monitoring. Finally, to decide whether we are in front of a fulfillment or of a violation, we should in general consider some form of Bayesian inference, generally on posterior probability. The simplest application would be just to consider the monitoring outcome, O or O first, as a way to produce a conclusion. This is although erroneous if the diagnostic accuracy is not ideal. This is well known in probability as the prosecutor's fallacy, but in practice it is still generally used. Finally, once we have concluded that there has been a violation of fulfillment, enforcer may apply punishment or reward. This is not certain. The law generally leaves a discretion space to the officer whether to enforce or not, and in any case, even in presence of duty, there may be impediments to the provision of enforcement, for instance due to the limitation of resources. We define, therefore, two probabilities for the provision of enforcement: the probability of obtaining a reward given the fact that there was fulfillment, the probability of obtaining a punishment given the fact that there was a violation. By using those factors, we went through all components relevant for a normed interaction. We used simple probabilistic components, but other tools may be used to enrich the model. In principle, there may be all kinds of cross-relationships between probabilistic and economic factors, and agents typically adapt to the implementation of norms. Unfortunately, most of the literature about these topics favor game-theoretical approaches that, although they are very useful to explore strategically relevant systematic patterns, they cannot go beyond the idea of static payoff tables. But is this model sound? We will validate it, confirming the theoretical observations of the functioning of enforcement regimes I provided you in the first part of the class. In order to do that, we will consider a simplified economic model. From the perspective of the enforcer authority, we will take into account a cost for unity of monitoring, which includes the amortized cost of setting up and keep running the monitoring infrastructure. The overall monitoring cost is given by the individual monitoring multiplied by the number of monitoring effectuated at one time step. Punishments, to be looked as fines, are incomes from the perspective of the authority. Rewards are instead costs. Those incomes or costs are for the authority aggregated for the number of punishments or rewards that are actually provided. From the perspective of the addressee, punishment is instead a cost, the fine to be paid. The reward is a benefit. There may be also a certification cost required to produce the proxy evidence or, finally, independently of the enforcement, the performance or non-performance of the action may have some other non-normative effects. This picture makes clear how enforcement is meant to modify the environmental rewards, positive or negative. From the point of view of the collectivity, performance and non-performance bring other effects, E star from performance and F star for non-performance, which we suppose to be linearly additive for simplicity. So the aggregated numbers come by considering the number of agents, the number of cases in which the norm is applicable, and the number of complying or non-complying agents. With these measures, we can write a general sustainability constraint, defined as the impact on the collectivity of compliance-non-compliance should be greater than the effort used by the authority to obtain it. This specific formula is obtained by summing the collectivity and authority columns of the previous tables and making some simplification. From the formula we can discriminate situations in which sticks or carrots have to be preferred. Sticks have to be preferred when people are generally compliant, as too many carrots make the system not sustainable. Punishment works already if there is only a perceived threat of punishment, so you could actually keep P of M low for some time, up to the moment in which people acknowledge that you're not really monitoring them. Carrots have to be preferred in case in which there is a singling out problem. That means that the probability of applicability is very low, and then the norm works as a sort of negative lottery. Someone is extracted to abide by it. The specification problem can be seen here as related to the individual cost of monitoring. If it is really difficult to discriminate good from bad behavior, you need to pay experts to do so, and thus taking a decision costs much more than when the specification problem does not hold. Carrots have also to be preferred in case in which agents are deemed by default non-compliant. From an economic point of view, we could obtain the same result by increasing punishment, but this will cause the agent to try to avoid context conditions in which the norm is applicable. If applicability cannot be escaped, avoidance goes at meta level, contesting the authority, and thus typically having an effect on the collectivity. This is not captured here as F star was presented as constant, but it is one of the possible functional dependencies that can be captured with richer models. Now, returning to an informal level, let us reconsider the cyber attack scenario. If you suffer from a cyber attack, share the information with the consortium. At the beginning of the attack, The probability of attack is low, so there is a singling out problem. Also, the attack is not really known, so there is a specification problem, although in this case at the level of applicable conditions. Carrots in this case serve better. After a while, if the attack becomes generalized, we know that there is a higher chance for an internet provider to be attacked, and also we know more the manifestations of attack. This means that both singling out and specification problems do not hold, so sticks have to be preferred. However, if releasing information has a too high negative impact for the individual provider, we may expect general non-compliance, and for this reason carrots may be still preferred. For the second norm, knowledge of the occurrence of the cyber attack and what type of defensive maneuver to apply are shared, so there is no singling out nor specification problem. In general, we should go for a punishment-based regime. However, as before, if a defensive maneuver are too expensive for the individual, you may expect general non-compliance, so carrots may serve better. We return as well to the initial rewards and punishments. Keep receipts to qualify for this tax exemption. Who provides evidence? The norm addressee, so it is a reward regime. Not extend temporary residence permits to offenders. Who provides evidence? Not the offenders. It is a punishment regime. Write down and sign agreements to buy a real estate. As buyer and seller bring evidence to the register by means of a notary, we are in front of a reward regime. Give a bonus to whom does not misbehave. As the case with the offender, the evidence won't be given by whom misbehaves. It is a punishment regime. So the takeaways from these classes are: is the threat of punishment a necessary condition for duty? Not really. If we look at behavioral preference underpinning the duty, we could promote it by means of rewards, and in some cases it will be more effective. The distinction between reward and punishment is primarily a matter of who is bringing evidence, not about who is enjoying or suffering enforcement. This also explains why reward systems favor the production of evidence. On the other hand, punishment-based systems are generally more sustainable, unless we are in front of a specification problem or a singling out problem or expected general non-compliance. To conclude, we also wanted to make clear that socio-technical systems cannot be approached by game theoretical approaches only. Modeling and simulation techniques offer a more general way to study the most adequate policy parameters against a model of the social context on which the policy will be applied, taking also into considerations model of adaptation. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to write me or use the discussion board.